MCC?
Well, the first time I came to MCC was probably in the early 70s. I had just gotten out of the Peace Corps, and I had been teaching for 2 years in West Africa, imagining that I might want to get into education, although I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I really, it was the first time I learned about the community college system was when I returned to Connecticut, and I was looking around and heard about MCC and visited the campus, or so-called campus. And my first impressions were not good, to be honest. It didn't look like a campus, and it didn't look like an educational institution. I was looking at the East Campus, and then, of course, Hartford Road. We had two campuses, the Hartford Road campus and the East Campus. But I met somebody that impressed me, and that was Andy Paterna. Andy was Director of Student Activities at the time. He was in the Student Center, and I went back and I started chatting with him, and I said, if people are like this is the kind of place I would enjoy working in. And that kind of got me thinking about going back to school, which I was thinking about anyway. But so I did. I went back to school, to UConn, got my master's degree in counseling, and then visited MCC on occasion during graduate school, and then looked for a position right after I graduated.
So you got hired here after graduation?
I got hired as a part-time counselor, which I was terrible at and really didn't like, to be honest. I worked with Ron Clinton, who was wonderful. He was my mentor, and Bill Graver in 1975, I think is what it was. And they were very supportive and very encouraging, and it wasn't my work. I figured out it just wasn't me. I needed to see more results of my work, and I really didn't see much in that position. And it just so happened that a friend of mine from high school, somebody that played football at East Catholic with me in the 60s, Barry Sheckley, was here. And he was working for the then brand new Division of Community Services started by Jim Tatro. And Barry and I were running together. We were, even then, we started running out on the roads then at MCC. And Barry said, I'm working in contract and grant programs for Jim Tatro. Why don't you do some work for us? We'll hire you part-time, and you can write grants and develop contract programs for the Community Services Division. And so that was really my second job, again, part-time. And I liked that. I really, I could see the results. You either get a grant funded or you don't. You get a program started or you don't. And it was a little more active, which is what I really needed. So I was finding my way. And I, working for Jim was quite I thought Jim Tatro was just a fabulous manager, visionary, great supervisor, very smart, willing to take risks, measured risks, gave his staff lots of room, and it was an atmosphere that I really enjoyed. So I stayed with that for a while.
So what was the campus culture like during the 1970s, both student and faculty staff?
Well, I can remember parts of it. I'm sure there's a lot I won't remember. Of course, it was the Vietnam War was still very much part of the news, and we had vets coming back to the campus, and I think that was part of certainly had an effect on the climate and activities at the campus. It was an exciting time for MCC, although I don't think I felt it right away. People were very excited about the East Campus. They had been working and teaching out of buildings in the town in Hartford Road, and the East Campus was their first, although temporary campus, was their first campus, and I think there was some excitement there. There were a lot of interesting people then, people who were excited about the whole idea of community college education and were willing to put lots of time and effort into their work. I remember Fred Ramey, for example, who was the division director at the time of the Business Careers Division, Fred Ramey and Dick Vizard. And they were they were as much faculty, I think, as they were administrators. They really got along well with the faculty, and they developed lots of programs. I mean, those were the years when lots of academic programs were developed, and there were a lot of very creative ideas and people who really worked hard to make sure they followed through on them. I was not part of that, but I was aware of what was going on, and I certainly admired some of the people, and particularly the faculty and the division directors and the work that they were doing. My job was somewhat isolated in the sense that I was at Hartford Road. I wasn't on the main campus, the East Campus. I wasn't really engaged in the traditional educational programs at the college. I was doing things very different, working with Pratt & Whitney to develop a program that we worked out with them for credit for their apprenticeship program and supplementary courses to round out the requirements for a degree program, and other types of grant programs and things. So I was really on the edge, not really connected tightly to what was going on the campus, although good, I developed some good friendships with Ron and Andy and others. And so it was an exciting time. It was a time of growth, although that never stopped. I mean, I think from the time that I started, we never stopped growing. It was just continuous. The college had a great reputation then in the community. Fred Lowe had done a wonderful job with that. Eleanor Coltman, of course, was well known and well respected and highly regarded. Steve Casano, I believe, was there at the time, although he may have been a student. Was he there as a faculty member? Yeah, Steve was a real leader. There were lots of Sid Lipshires, although he really wasn't engaged in organizing the union at the time when I started. It wasn't long after that he began that. So I think among the community college system, employees, a lot of the leadership for programs and services and certainly collective bargaining and all that came from MCC. So it was an exciting time.
Tell us a little about the arc of your career as you moved into the 80s and 90s here.
Well, once I figured out that I liked being involved in the administrative end of things, I took considerable risk, according to Jim Tatro, and took a position as assistant to the president for Ron Dennison, who was a very unpopular president when I was hired by him, which I knew. But I did see it as an opportunity for me to get involved in things that I had not had the opportunity to get involved with in community services. And I also saw that the college was simply going to grow, and if it was going to succeed at all, there's a lot of opportunity for somebody in administration to do interesting things. And I guess I should say that my first office at Hartford Road was in a closet, and I went to private school. I went to East Catholic High School. I was in the first graduating class, so I started high school in a brand new high school facility. I went on to school at Holy Cross, beautiful campus, beautiful facilities. And when I came here, it was obvious. It was just really stark obvious to me, this difference between the quality of the people and the talent that was here and the facilities that they were working in. And to have an office in a closet, Hartford Road, it was just, I knew that wouldn't last. It couldn't last if the institution was going to succeed. I didn't know at the time that I would play a role later on in developing the campus, but it's certainly on my mind that one of the things that this college needed was a campus, a real campus, and a permanent campus. Which is why I think deep down I took the job. I thought, didn't know exactly where it would lead, but Herb Bandis, who was the dean of administration at the time, was not a very popular dean of administration, and either with the president or the other deans or the faculty for that matter, although brilliant man, PhD physics from Chicago, I believe, University of Michigan. Worked on the Manhattan Project, very smart man. And gradually, when I worked for Ron Dennison, Ron gave me a lot more responsibility, continued to add to my responsibilities, and then I began to see the opportunities. Yeah.
You really were one of the drivers behind the transformation from the East Campus low building and now the facility we're in now. Can you talk about your role in those years in planning and developing newer buildings?
Well, my job evolved, really. When I first took my assistant to the president job, we didn't have unions. There was no collective bargaining, although I was responsible for personnel administration, payroll. Herb was responsible for facilities, but there was a master plan that I discovered later on, but there wasn't a lot of talk about the master plan. I don't think early on. Maybe I should give you an example of something that happened to me early on that led me to believe that maybe this is a niche for me. There was a faculty member, Chris Bila was her name. Interesting woman. She worked at, if I recall correctly, she worked at Mystic part-time. She was very into the environment and anyway, a fascinating person. And I used to see her every once in a while. We'd sit down and have a conversation. One day she was telling me about this book that she read called Economics as If People Mattered, written by E.F. Shoemaker. At the time, it was a very popular book. And she said, if we could get somebody like that to come to our campus, that would be just fabulous. And I said, well, let's. And she looked at me like, well, I don't doubt he's going to come to MCC. And I was working in community services at the time. And I said, look, let's call him. I mean, he lives in England, but we can figure that out. And he's probably got a phone number, and we can call him and invite him. And I did. I got a hold of an international operator at the time, and somehow we found his number in Surrey, England, and called him, and he was on the other line, and Chris was sitting there with me. And I said, gee, here we are at MCC. You have a following here. Is there any chance that you would ever, in your travels, and he was traveling a lot, promoting this book, and he said, look, I'm coming to New York this spring or whenever it was, and he said, I'll stop by. How far are you from New York? And I said, we'll pick you up, we'll take care of you. So he visited our campus. Of course, we took him out to Willie's. He was a vegetarian, and Willie's at the time, Willie's Steakhouse. But he was a fascinating guy. But my point is, then, and I think a lot of people who started at MCC came out of the high school systems, and they were teachers, and their focus was on the classroom and their students, and so you couldn't expect them necessarily to have a vision of a community college of the future in terms of facilities and campus and all of that. But I did think then, and I've always thought of this, that I always go back to this when I think about the early days, that there was a tremendous amount of talent, but there wasn't really guided, and it wasn't a lot of vision. Jim had it. Jim Tatro had it. And I think I learned a lot from Jim about that. This idea of, taking your current circumstances and then projecting into the future to see where it is you might want to be and need to be. And I thought that the college had a great potential, but we needed to encourage people to think big and to take risks. And that was not part of the culture, my view at the time. And that's not to say that there weren't people who took risks. Bob Fenn, who was the Dean of Academic Affairs, he was also responsible for the development of a lot of programs. And I think he was a risk taker too. He's an interesting guy, kind of a business-minded biology teacher. I think he's a science guy, but he did a lot of good work, and so I think it's important to remember him. So that really began to shape my thinking about the college and the role that I might play in the future.
Mm-hmm. And when did you get involved in the master planning for this facility that we're in now?
I joined shortly after I became the Dean of Administration. I joined an organization called SCUP, the Society for College and University Planning. And I attended their conferences. And many of their conferences had to do with planning, facilities planning, master planning, something I knew really nothing about. And I went to a particular conference where it was dedicated to this whole idea of developing master plans. And I came away really with some good information and some confidence that this is something that I could do if I was given the opportunity. Now, I wasn't initially. At the time, Bill Vincent was president, and Bill wasn't really there. He had other interests, and there was a period of time there that Bill was more interested in building an art center, which I thought was a distraction because I didn't know where they were going to get the funding, and I didn't think it was the highest need. We had classrooms that we were growing out of, and we didn't have lots of types of facilities that we really needed as a college. But when Jonathan Dowby was hired, again, his interest was elsewhere too. He was more focused on the internal personnel matters at the college, I think part because he was recovering from what he had gone through at his previous college, and he wanted to make sure that things were going smoothly with staff. On the other hand, he didn't discourage me. He didn't have a different idea, and he gave me a lot of room. And so I began to explore this idea. Now, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm. There was no enthusiasm because very few people thought there was any opportunity for us to get funding for whatever reason. I think part of it was lack of vision. Part of it was lack of confidence. I think people just didn't have the confidence that the state would recognize community colleges in a way that we were talking about. And there wasn't much money at the time either. But I did see a path. Through master planning, I saw a path to get at least some of what I thought we needed. And really, I teamed up with Barbara Natale, and I think a lot of people don't know this, but Barbara became interested in master planning. She was the director of library services at the time. And in addition to understanding the mechanics of putting together a master plan, we knew right away that there's an awful lot of politics that goes along with getting a lot of money from the state of Connecticut for a building project. And Barbara and I, together, started taking photos of the East Campus and its limitations and its deterioration, termites and all. And this is a little-known story, I think, but we then learned that this guy, Fred Jelsey, who was representative from Enfield, Connecticut, co-chaired the Bond Commission. Now, the Bond Commission is where you go to get funding for any building project in the state of Connecticut to get bonded. And Fred Jelsey was co-chair. And everybody that we talked to, and we talked to a lot of people, said, if you want to get to the Bond Commission, you have to get to Fred Jelsey. And we made a cold call, Barbara and I did one day. We took our slides to his office. We did not have an appointment. We walked in, and we heard that he was a fairly friendly guy, and he was a supporter in general of community colleges. He had one in his district, Asnunta Community College. And we laid out these photos, and we said, this is, I know you know Manchester Community College. We were then the biggest. We also had a great reputation. The faculty of the college and the staff had created this wonderful reputation. And when we finished laying out these slides and pictures, photos to him, he looked up and he says, why hasn't anyone ever told me this? And I learned later the answer to that question, part of the answer, I probably didn't know the full answer, but part of the answer was that the board's position at the time was to build community colleges in succession. And Bridgeport and Housatonic Community College had been in line to get the next building. The problem was that Bridgeport didn't have the political clout as a city in the legislature to get a building approved. And they didn't have the president, I think. That's what I was told. That's not for me to say, but that's what I was told, that the president down there was having difficulty getting support from his legislators. And we'd been waiting many, many years, I found out, so that we were lined up somewhere behind Housatonic Community College. And that's where, again, Jonathan, I think, came in, and he was perfectly comfortable with us going out on our own. In other words, not going through our board in the system office and asking, could we talk to this one or could we do this. We just did it. And we got political support, and there was a lot of it because this region of Connecticut has a lot of very powerful legislators, Mary Ann Hanley among them. And so we did get, and we knew we had Fred Jelsey. Fred Jelsey said to us, you get your plan together, and you get some people to get behind this project. And he said, I co-chair the bond commission, I'll help you. So we knew then that we had that opportunity. So it evolved. It really did evolve, and that gave us the confidence and the motivation to say, "Listen, we've got to put all this together." And of course, not long after that, UConn came up with their $1 billion, I don't know what it was called, the Year 2000 program or whatever. It was a huge program. And again, some people say you're not going to get anything because UConn's going to take it all. And my view was, it was perfect for us because somebody was going to figure out you had to do something for community colleges if you're going to give UConn $1 billion. So it just depended who got in line next. And then many people get involved. Of course, Jonathan must have gotten involved, although I don't really remember that part of it as much because he probably did that on his own. And we did get a lot of support. Nobody thought we'd get 2 buildings. In fact, Andy McCurdy at the time, my wife reminds me of Andy's reaction to our meeting with Andy McCurdy, where we said, listen, we really don't need 1 building, we need 2 to get off the East Campus. 1 wouldn't do it. I mean, we'd end up leaving half of the East Campus there, and Andy said something about, don't even think about it. You're not getting 2 buildings. But of course we did. I think people underestimated really the reputation of the college. And I've always gone back, there's just no question in my mind, whoever we talked with about this, would always say, it's a great college. You're doing great things over there. Keep it up. And then we'd show them the facilities and what we're up against, and they just couldn't believe it. I mean, how can you do all this with these buildings and with this campus? So, and the timing was right. We planned when the economy was poor and funds were not available, and we were ready to go when things turned around and there was money available. So our timing was right, in part by luck, but in part, it was just common sense. You plan when things are slow and you build when things are good. So we got into that cycle.
You must feel quite a sense of pride when you walk through these corridors.
I do. I feel, looking back, that it was something that, I contributed to the college. And we certainly needed it, but lots of people contributed to it. I want to make sure that's understood, that so many people contributed, and mostly the faculty and staff. When we hired Stecker LeBeau to do the master plan, they just couldn't believe how engaged the college community got into this process. I mean, we had meetings day in and day out, and they were always well attended, and people had great ideas about their programs and where they were going and what kind of space they needed that they didn't have. It really was an easy job for Stecker LeBeau. So you really had an opportunity there to get all that good thinking together in one place and put together an interesting program.
Aside from the development of the physical plan, how did the college change in the 35 years or so that you were connected with it?
Well, we grew in size so much, and that changes the dynamics, the interpersonal dynamics of an institution. The days, the early days when Fred Lowe could sit around with the faculty and all the faculty and staff and talk about, whatever, next program, any problems, any issues that came up, and solve them right then and there. Those days went away gradually over time when we added new staff and students' enrollment just grew so much. And, every once in a while we'd have to stop and take a look back and say, listen, we're a different institution. We're bigger. It requires a different set of skills to manage this institution. And I don't think we ever kept up, and maybe you never do, but we certainly made an effort at it. And I think we're still evolving as an institution, because we're still growing as an institution. But in terms of decision making and planning and coordinating and communicating within the institution, making sure that people are together and there's a sense of community here, that's a real challenge when an institution is growing so fast. And so everybody's distracted in part by all the work that they have to do with limited resources. So I always felt busy, and I think everybody else did too. That's the sense that I had then.
Anything else you'd like to discuss that we haven't covered?
There's some people that I think need to be mentioned. Steve Bidstrup, who was the director of facilities for the system office, he passed away several years ago. And Steve was very instrumental in working with us on our master plan and helping us understand the politics of master planning and funding for buildings. He was a great guy and deserves a lot of credit. There's a building named after him out at Tunxus Community College, and because he did so much work with Tunxus, but he did work with all the community colleges. Did a great job. I don't think there are any heroes. When I look back in anticipation of this, there were just so many good players. Because it's impossible, in a way, to measure the contributions of, say, a John Gustafson, who was a brilliant guy and wonderfully humorous all the time and just great to be around. Well, how do you describe and capture what he offered? You can't. And yet, without people like John Gustafson and others like him, the community would have been a different community. So, and I don't know all the names and I don't recall, but I bet, and I hope as you're doing this, you don't focus just on the principal players, but there are so many people who contributed so much to the culture of this institution, which has always been a relatively healthy culture. It was only when Ron Dennison just took so many bad turns and was so heavy-handed, and you simply couldn't get away with that here. This faculty just wasn't going to tolerate that, and he couldn't figure that out. But that really was a measure of the health of the community, in my view. It was that they wouldn't stand for that kind of leadership. But anyway, I also should say, I didn't know, one thing I really did not understand and appreciate, what do I got, to 7 o'clock? I spent 6 months at Naugatuck Valley Community College. Mark Herzog asked me once, the dean there left, and the school was in a bit of trouble financially. They really weren't managing their finances, and Mark asked me to go there for 6 months at a difficult time for me because we were involved in the master planning process here. But I said as long as I can stay engaged in the master planning process, but let other things, reassign other things to Marie Solomon, who I should mention because she was absolutely brilliant. She's an example of somebody who absolutely contributed to this wonderful culture that I think we have here at MCC. In a key position, she was Director of Personnel and Contract Administration. But anyway, at Naugatuck, aside from the challenge of going to another school just for 6 months and trying to get things together, I was aware at the first management meeting, it really was a very white male-centered institution. It was literally almost all at the top of that institution. Not a lot of attention had been paid to affirmative action. And the conversations were different. They were absolutely different. They weren't as interesting. there weren't the challenges and the different points of view that we just came to expect at MCC. So it was really so obvious, but only when I left and to another institution. Then when I came back, I really did understand and appreciate the contributions that Jonathan Dalby made in terms of affirmative action and building a diversified staff. And again, that's something that you never succeed at, but you continue to work at, and it grows. But it's an ideal that I didn't understand. And I think a healthy institution is diverse, and a healthy institution does look to different points of view and encourages different points of view and listens to different points of view. And I think MCC has done that probably better than any of the other community colleges. And I think that is maybe, right up there with some other things that is responsible for the great successes of the college.
Anything else?
Just one quick one. I'm just thinking about the continuity because you skipped over from Denison, but you had Bob Miller,
Yeah.
Bill Vincent, you had Jonathan,
Yeah.
and Gina, and survived all through that track. You want to comment on that at all, or is there anything you talk about?
Well, I worked for every president, not directly. No, I don't know. Maybe Lowe had left when I started part-time employment, but every president from Denison on, who was the second president. And, Ron Denison's administration was, in many ways, just a disaster. It was. I mean, he really didn't understand the culture. He didn't understand the strength of the values that people held on to dearly. This idea of, a community of people engaged in figuring out things, not hearing about what needs to be done from somebody from above. And Bob Miller was a great transition. Bob was a great guy and a wonderful president, very gentle, great sense of humor, good speaker, good leader, just generally. And that was a pleasure for me. It was like the stressful years of Denison went away when Bob walked in the door, and I worked for him for a year. And then I think Bill Vincent, too. I thought Bill was a very good president and a pleasure to work with. He again, had a great sense of humor, wonderful storyteller. I think he fit well here when he was here. And that was an enjoyable time for me, too. And Jonathan. And Jonathan was a interesting and challenging person to work with, but in the end, I give him a lot of credit, and it was a really good experience. Jonathan was very open to conversations and debates and arguments and all of that, and I think we did all right.
Good. Thank you. Very good.
It's exhausting.